From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome now to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. We begin today, of course, with President Trump and his battle with COVID. We're waiting right now for another update from Walter Reed. Chief of Staff Mark Meadows says that a decision will be made this afternoon on whether to release the president. And the president's press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, has now tested positive for the virus. For the latest, we turn now to our Bloomberg contributor, Rick Davis. Rick, welcome. It's good to see you. Things are developing fairly quickly here. What is your take on the White House and its handling of this crisis at this point?
Hi, David. Thanks. And, we all have our thoughts and prayers with everybody who's been afflicted by this disease and virus. And that includes the White House team, President, First Lady, and now what is a growing list of senior aides and probably junior aides who have been in an environment which was lax when it came to normal standard procedures associated with COVID, wearing a mask, social distancing, trying to take as much outdoors as you can, and working from home. And none of those things were standard operating procedures at the White House. So I think that the American public's getting a look at when you take risks. You're going to have to pay the piper, and that's what's happening today.
Before any of this happened, Rick, one of the big questions in the election coming up just a month from right now, one of the big questions was, do we trust President Trump more than we trust former Vice President Joe Biden to handle this crisis? And the president was already behind in most of the polls on that score. What do you think has happened because of this? Because, first of all, we're getting conflicting, sometimes ambiguous or confusing briefings from his doctor at Walter Reed over the weekend. There was a lot of walking things back. Mark Meadows, the chief of staff, disagreeing. And at the same time, we actually also saw the president now get into his SUV, a very closed and contained SUV with two Secret Service agents, to drive past the people outside. He says he gets it. Does he get it?
Well, it's difficult to say whether or not he gets it, right? I mean, the president criticized Joe Biden repeatedly through the campaign trail and most recently at the debates for using a mask as a way of dramatizing the coronavirus. And yet, now it looks like that was exactly the right approach that the vice president was taking, by wearing masks to all his events and socially distancing. So the criticism is now coming back to haunt him. The issue that the White House hasn't really been able to create a positive narrative around Trump getting sick and then going to the hospital and managing the case while he's at the hospital with differing reports between the doctors and the chief of staff are really causing a lot of concern in the public mind because they can't get the straight story. And of course, these are the kinds of things where you just don't want to make mistakes. So the fact they're not on top of this does not reflect well on their management of COVID in general, but specifically the president's health.
In the meantime, we do have an election going on. There's campaigning going on at least some places. What does this do to the president's ability, his team's ability, actually? He also has his campaign manager who's tested positive for the virus. Can they really go forward forcefully with a campaign in these final days?
His campaign manager has tested positive. His lead advisor, Governor Chris Christie, has tested positive, who has been helping him through the debates. I would say that we don't know empirically how this is going to affect him. We don't have polling data since the president contracted COVID. But we do know what's happened since the debates. And there's been a spike in Biden's ballot nationally and in some states from polling taken after the last debate. So if there was any question as to who was going to take advantage of that debate, it looks like it's Biden, to the point where in the latest Wall Street Journal NBC poll, he's almost doubled his national average and increased in states like Pennsylvania in other surveys. So right now, I would say the president has, I wouldn't say bigger problems than COVID, but the election is slipping away at a time where, you've got only 29 days left before Election Day.
Well, and as you point out, he's playing from behind, at least according to almost all the polls now, say he's behind nationally and including in some of the key swing states, like Michigan that we're going to take a look at this week. So he's got to play from behind. What can he do to turn this around? Because it feels right now like the momentum's going away from him, not with him.
Well, he's using advertising. and social media to try and reboot the campaign while he's not doing his events. But even in that area, Biden, because he has had such a successful fundraising campaign, is outspending him in every single category with paid media. So what is the earned media impact? He's not on the campaign trail. And the next debate comes just on the heels of a 2-week quarantine that you would assume the president would respect. And so will there be another debate for the president to try and get back in this race? Without that debate, I can't imagine there's an event or a scenario that would catapult the attention of the voters. But then again, who would have thought we'd be sitting here talking about the president sitting in Walter Reed with COVID a week ago? So anything can happen in this election.
Anything can happen. Can a stimulus bill get passed in this election?
Well, I think this is one of the things that could be a victim of COVID. There seems to have been some momentum between the president and his negotiators and Speaker Pelosi at the end of last week, none of which has really come to fruition. There's bailout packages for the airlines where they're holding off firing thousands of employees if they can get this deal done. Nancy Pelosi, the speaker, continues to say that they can get a deal done, but the longer it takes, the less likelihood it is that something's going to happen before Election Day.
In the meantime, finally, what is your advice to Joe Biden right now?
Well, I think he's doing exactly what you would expect Joe Biden to do. He's taken his negative ads down because an abundance of caution and not wanting to look like he's using the president's COVID diagnosis as a advantage. He's going high, not low. At the same time, he is spending time in these targeted states, Florida today, and Pennsylvania, Ohio after the debates, and so I think he's doing the right stuff. At some point in time, and this is going to be a big week, Kamala Harris is going to have her debut on the national stage as vice presidential nominee, and she'll be debating on Wednesday the Vice President Pence, and that will be the next big event. So she needs a good performance in order to keep the momentum alive for Biden.
Okay, thank you so much to our Bloomberg political contributor. He's Rick Davis. He just set up the fact that he's going to be with us for live coverage of that vice presidential debate. That starts on Wednesday night at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Coming up, a president taking ill has potential ramifications around the world. We talk with Riva Gujan of the Martin Crumpton Group. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's not just the United States, but the entire world, which is watching President Trump as he battles this coronavirus. For what this could mean geopolitically, welcome now Riva Gujan. She is Martin Crumpton Group Managing Director. So, Riva, great to have you back with us. So give us a sense right now. We actually have Secretary of State Pompeo over in Tokyo right now with a Quad meeting going on. He's going to come back early. What does this disease that the president have, his hospitalization, potentially mean internationally?
Well, everybody's obviously watching what's happening in the White House cluster very, very closely. This is a high-profile case, and it does seem to favor the chances for a Biden presidency. But I don't think any country is really taking any chances. Most are doing their contingency planning, preparing for either outcome. But obviously, the distraction in the United States, the disinformation opportunities on social media. Those are very ripe. This is the American election story is like something out of a Greek drama. And so lots of fodder there for those disinformation campaigns and maybe some potential to leverage that distraction. And particularly, I would look at those powers that are stuck in those negotiating stalemates that are looking to sort of set the stage for the first 100 days of the next president's, incoming tenure. And so, you look at North Korea, stuck in a negotiation with the U.S. that really hasn't gone anywhere, potential for an ICBM test. You look at Iran, has a lot stacked up against it with either president, but still in its nuclear freeze and could push the nuclear program, activities in the Strait of Hormuz. And then you've got already brewing conflicts, like in the Caucasus, where you have Turkey essentially giving the green light to Azerbaijan a proxy conflict that could draw Russia in yet another proxy battle where it's on opposing sides with Turkey. And, that is another area that could draw U.S. attention. So lots of different hotspots to watch, but I think a lot of countries are still very much in wait and see mode.
Reva, is there anything a president, or for that matter, somebody who's running for president, I'll include former Vice President Biden here, anything they can do to send a message around the world, this is not the time to push us? Because as you suggest, there are some rivals to the United States that might take the opportunity to say, okay, let's take a little advantage here for a time.
Well, this is where, obviously the election itself has already been a big distraction for the sitting president. And so a lot has already been delegated. So the important thing is to show business as usual. So, if you see, especially in South China Sea, Taiwan Strait, military patrols, things like that, those are all ways to kind of show, look, we're here, nothing's changed in the status quo. So I think you can expect things like that. Visits like Pompeo to Tokyo, reinforcing this notion of the Quad, Australia, India, Japan, U.S., and trying to show a strong counterbalance to China. Those are the kinds of things that you can expect to see as well, where the Biden campaign is also going to be focusing on those foreign relationships and saying, this is not necessarily a distraction that can be taken advantage of, that change is to come.
Is this potentially good news, at least in the short term, for China? Because both President Trump and, to some extent, Vice President Biden have been wanting to put pressure on China. That Quad group, as I understand it, that's one of their main goals, is to make sure that they allow some pressure to be brought to bear on China. Right now, does this mean essentially China has more of a free hand?
Maybe to some limited extent. This does provide an opportunity, kind of like with earthquake diplomacy, right, between two tense neighbors or two tense powers, where we've already seen the Chinese President Xi Jinping and his wife send a get well letter to President Trump and Melania. And it also allows China to contrast itself with the American response to the pandemic and show progress on its vaccine rollout and use that as a soft power tool to other countries, middle powers that are hungry for that vaccine, and China positioning itself that way. But when it comes to a distracted U.S., a chaotic outcome, everybody is looking at the same factors there. Russia has more of a history there in terms of those disinformation campaigns, but China still has a lot to worry about. And this Quad meeting, which is really about trying to give a backbone to this alliance, semi-alliance, I should say, between Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, is a real test. And China has always termed this as an anti-China club. And now, especially after Ladakh, the crisis on the India-China border, and also the fast deteriorating relationship between Australia and China, there's a lot of momentum for the U.S. to take advantage of, whether it's a Biden presidency or a Trump presidency. And China certainly is concerned about a more united front against it.
So finally, Reva, what do you tell your clients when they ask you a question I'm sure they must ask, which is, what is the one single biggest difference between a foreign policy of a President Biden, if he gets to be president, and a President Trump?
It really comes down to tactics, because the structural forces are still very much there. I still think you're looking at a building crisis over Taiwan and the South China Sea, still major differences economically. But if you can reconstruct a dialogue with Beijing, as you had during the Obama administration, and you also have a lot of incentive in Beijing for reforms, and the reformists in Beijing are saying, look, the geopolitical climate is just another factor that means we need to create a more competitive climate at home for our businesses. If you do see real reforms and traction on that front, that could also help create a more positive negotiating climate to help manage the competition overall. But make no mistake, that competition is still building across a number of domains.
Reva, really great to have you on, as it always is. That's Reva Goujon, now with Martin Crumpton Group. She's a managing director there. We turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
No relation, David. Thank you. President Trump is ready to return to a normal work schedule. That from White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, who says the president's condition continued to improve overnight. Meadows tells Fox News that Mr. Trump is making, quote, unbelievable progress. He says the decision whether to release the president from the hospital today will be made after consultations with the president's medical staff. Another person who works closely with President Trump has been infected with COVID-19. In a tweet, White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany says she has tested positive. McEnany says she is showing no symptoms but will begin the quarantine process. She also says she didn't know about the president's aide Hope Hicks's diagnosis before holding a White House press briefing on Tuesday. Chicago Fed President Charles Evans is sounding optimistic about the outlook for the U.S. economy. Evans spoke with Bloomberg's Michael McKee earlier today.
I think the economic recovery has been pretty good. In fact, it's been a little quicker than I was expecting back in June when I submitted a forecast. I had been quite nervous about there's a normal recovery where we get back to the level of where we were going into this, sometime, in 2022 maybe, and then, we seem to have been doing better than that.
Evans also said he's hopeful there will be more fiscal stimulus going forward. The Republican plan to confirm Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett by Election Day is now in peril. 3 Republican senators have tested positive for the coronavirus in the past few days, and at least 8 others are known to have had direct exposure. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's narrow margin for confirming Judge Barrett would evaporate if just 3 Republicans were unable to vote. Another tropical storm has formed in the Caribbean. Tropical storm Delta is expected to strengthen to a hurricane, endangering the Cayman Islands and Cuba on a path into the Gulf of Mexico. Meanwhile, Tropical Storm Gamma stalled just north of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula today after lashing the coast with near hurricane-force winds and drenching rain. At least 6 people were killed. Thousands were forced from their homes. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks very much, Mark. Still ahead here, the House Antitrust Subcommittee is close to releasing its big report on big tech. We'll get an update on that next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. It's time for our check on the markets, and for that, we turn to Scarlet Fu. Scar, how are we doing? Pretty well. Risk on.
Pretty well right now. Risk on. Yeah, whatever the scenario right now, it's pretty bullish for risk today with stocks and commodities recovering from Friday's drop, treasuries falling, the 10-year yield rising to 76 basis points. That's a 4-month high, and the dollar weakening. And it all boils down to stimulus. President Trump tweeting that a deal needs to get done. Nancy Pelosi, the speaker, saying as much on Friday. But the two sides are still pretty far apart, David. Dems want $2.2 to $2.4 trillion. The Republicans are looking at $1.5 trillion. But the thinking now is no matter who is president, stimulus is needed for this economy. And Joe Biden's lead in the polls is widening. That's reducing the odds of a contested election and increasing talk of a Democratic sweep. So if we get a blue wave, that could pave the way for even more stimulus and deficit spending. That would raise the risk of inflation. Goldman Sachs reportedly says that could pull forward an eventual Fed rate increase by 2 years, up to 2 years. And the yield curve is steepening as a result. It's giving a lift to banks, which, as you know, borrow at the short end of the yield curve and lend out at the long end. Now, Morgan Stanley's Jim Caron says that the rise in yields is limited because of Fed determination to keep rates lower for longer, as well as quantitative easing. So net, this pushes real yields lower and the dollar weaker, and that produces easier financial conditions, which is positive for risky assets.
Okay, thank you so much to Scarlet Fu for that report on the markets. In the meantime, the Antitrust Subcommittee of the House Judiciary Committee has been conducting extensive hearings about how antitrust laws should be applied to big tech, and its report is due out any time now. For a preview, we welcome Bill Baer of the Brookings Institution. Mr. Baer served as the Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust in the Obama administration. So, Bill, it's great to have you back with us. What do you know? As I understand, you actually testified before the subcommittee. What do you think we're going to hear out of it?
Well, another slow news day, I take it up. I testified last Thursday. It's the final hearing before this report comes out. What's unusual about this report is it really reflects not just a couple of hearings with the CEOs and other things, but a 15 or 16-month deep dive looking at non-public documents subpoenaed from the 4 companies. And what the subcommittee was able to do, and should be reflected in the report, was understand motivations behind certain acquisitions, motivations behind certain changes in rules and requirements by these very dominant high-tech platforms. So we're likely to have a factual basis for whatever recommendations come forward. That's point one. Point two is interacting with the members of that subcommittee on Thursday, both in the public testimony and in some private conversations. There is more of a bipartisan consensus that we need to do some things. We need to increase funding for antitrust enforcement, and at a minimum, we need to modify the antitrust laws to direct the courts to be a little bit more receptive to challenges to mergers and challenges to monopolization behavior than they have been in the past.
Well, so let's talk about that more specifically, Bill, if we could. How would they do that? I understand giving more resources, but modify the antitrust laws. Is that actually changing the Sherman Act or the Clayton Act to assess competitive consequences differently?
I think that's right. Amy Klobuchar on the Senate side has a bill in that would change the merger standard from a tendency to substantially reduce competition to a tendency to materially reduce competition, and make it clear that they want to err on the side of blocking increasing concentrations in already concentrated markets and be more skeptical of acquisitions by dominant firms of nascent startups. So there really is talk for the first time in my lifetime about changing the antitrust laws, not dramatically, but to get the courts to be more receptive to antitrust challenges by the federal antitrust agencies.
So is that barring the door after the horse has left the barn already? I mean, for example, in the Instagram deal, would it affect the Instagram deal? And by the way, that never made it to the courts. It's not like the courts applied a standard that didn't work. They didn't even challenge it, did they?
Right. I think Federal Trade Commission concluded that under existing law, both Instagram and WhatsApp, those two Facebook acquisitions, were not covered by the current language of the Clayton Act, or at least by the way the courts have interpreted it. So the notion would be to try and get the courts, direct the courts to be more receptive to challenges by the antitrust agencies. Now, you could go back, and the FTC may be looking at this with regard to Facebook or acquisitions by other firms and say, hey, this is actually, looking back, a pattern of monopolization under the Sherman Act. And therefore, we ought to go in, as the courts did years ago with the Standard Oil Trust, and force divestiture or limit the ability of a dominant firm to make acquisitions going forward. So there is some ability to look backwards. But I think the subcommittee's focus is on trying to toughen the antitrust laws so we can deal with concern about growing concentration.
What about something perhaps even more radical than that, Bill? We've heard from the chair of the subcommittee, the antitrust subcommittee, David Cicilline, talking about something like the equivalent of a Glass-Steagall law with respect to antitrust. That is to say, if you have a platform, if you run a platform, as Google does, as Facebook does, you cannot also appear on that platform. Is there any likelihood of that?
Well, Chairman Cicilline has been an articulate proponent of that as something that ought to be on the legislative agenda. I don't know that there is bipartisan support for that, but I think it will be in the report, and I think there will be support from some members of that subcommittee for going that far, that whole separation of functions notion.
So, Bill, this reads against, I think, the supposed case against Google that we're about to have come out. We were promised it actually by the end of last month. We're now into October. We don't have it. But where does that sit at this point? I know that the Department of Justice was consulting with state attorneys general.
My understanding is that consultation is going on, that there is a lot of pushback from some state AGs and from the career staff at the Antitrust Division. They don't think this case is ready for prime time. And they're worried that this is going to be perceived as simply a political complaint, get out there ahead of the election. So there is considerable pushback and controversy. Bill Barr is running the show. The head of the Antitrust Division is recused from this. So it is a complaint that apparently is likely to come out in the next week or so. But how it will be viewed by the public, how it will be viewed by the courts is caught up in this whole sense that the Barr Justice Department is more political than is appropriate for a law enforcement agency.
But is the concern on the part of the attorneys general of the states, as far as you can tell, that it doesn't go far enough or it goes too far?
I think that it's not ready for prime time. I do think there are some states that think, in addition to taking a look at how Google contracts with Apple and other cell phone manufacturers with regard to using its search engine, Safari, as the default on these phones. That's one concern. But they're also concerned about how they work with advertisers, how they limit the ability of advertisers to appear on other search engines. So there is a second level concern relating to the advertising side of the market. And that, I think, is an area where the state AGs think there ought to be antitrust focus as well.
So, Bill, just to put a button on this, as far as you're concerned, do you think we're going to have to wait till after the election before this suit gets filed?
I think it's going to be filed before, but I think it's going to be tainted by the sense that there was a rush to judgment here, or a rush to get the complaint out in advance of an election, which to me is just the worst way to bring about law enforcement, antitrust, or anything else.
Okay, thank you so much. It's always a delight to talk to you. That's Bill Baer, visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, former Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust. San Francisco Mayor London Breed is facing pressure to reopen the city faster after imposing some of California's strictest measures to contain the virus. Breed spoke exclusively to Bloomberg on Friday after we first learned that President Trump tested positive for COVID-19.
It's unfortunate when anyone gets COVID. And what we hope is that people are, especially leaders, are leading by example. I don't like wearing masks, but I wear them. I don't like social distancing. I want to be around people, but I understand that I could infect somebody and they can infect me. So it can't be about me. It has to be about the behavior that I model so that others can follow. They need to understand how significant this is and how it could basically be devastating to a densely populated city like San Francisco. And this is important. And so from my perspective, this is why from day one, I have tried to communicate everything I know and the facts and use data in the decision-making process of this virus. And just to remind people, like, yes, we want it to be over. We're tired of COVID, but COVID is not tired of us. And it's just not going to go away because we want it to. We have to do our part.
Now, many states and cities have been following the president's lead on this and reopened potentially faster than San Francisco did. And I wonder if you think the president's condition will change the way this plays out, change how some of these other cities and states are reacting.
Well, I hope it does. I think that, you know, what it shows people is that no one is immune, that it can happen to anyone at any given time. And when you think about, you know, someone who is possibly, you know, elderly and maybe unhealthy, it could be even worse. The impacts of COVID could be devastating. So I hope that this is a wake-up call for so many people who are refusing to wear masks and who are moving forward with their lives as if nothing is wrong, as if we're not still in a pandemic. And this should be an example for sure.
Rents are falling sharply in major metropolitan areas and in San Francisco. How concerned are you about an economic slowdown in San Francisco, given that tech companies are paring back workers and people are leaving the city, and that means you're going to have a lower tax base? Well,
I will say that I'm very concerned. I just balanced a budget with a $1.5 billion budget deficit. And not to mention, there are over 200,000 people who have filed for unemployment in this city. We have businesses that I've been going to since I was a kid that have closed permanently. So I am definitely concerned about the economic impacts of what's happening. It's not about just tech companies fleeing, it's about business in general. In light of COVID and working from home and having more flexibility in the cost of living, and also the number of tax measures and other things that have really put us in a situation where I think we're going to have some challenges over the next couple of years. But the fact is, we're San Francisco. we're a major city and people love coming to this city. They love working in this city. They love going to restaurants in this city. And so you can't just create this someplace else in a suburb. You only get what you can get from a place like San Francisco by being in a place like San Francisco. It's going to be hard for us for some time, but I think eventually we'll get back to a better place.
That was San Francisco Mayor London Breed speaking with Bloomberg's Emily Chang on Friday. We're going to turn from the coronavirus to energy. Energy policy is one of the major issues that separates the two candidates for president, with President Trump seeking to strengthen U.S. production of oil, gas, and coal, and former Vice President Biden planning to eliminate reliance on fossil fuels for power generation by 2035. Welcome now someone who knows energy like no other. Dan Yergin is chairman of IHS Markit and author, most recently, of The New Map: Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. So, Dan, great to have you back with us. So put this in a larger perspective. As I say, we've got two very different approaches. If you listen to Joe Biden, it sounds like we're just around the corner from a major energy transformation. If you listen to President Trump, it sounds like it's not going to happen anytime soon.
Thank you, David. It's great to be on with you again. And it is a pretty big gulf between the two candidates. The Trump administration has been focused on this new position the United States has as the world's #1 producer of oil and gas, and what that does for the economy and what it does for the position in the world. Joe Biden has a $2 trillion climate action plan, which is very focused on addressing climate things. And I think in terms of oil and gas, it's a little unclear where he is. He made a point to say when he was in Pennsylvania, where there are a lot of jobs related to fracking, as it's called, that I'm not going to ban fracking, but clearly it's a pivot towards climate, and I think certainly more regulation around oil and gas.
From what you know of the technology and the development and the markets, because the market drives it as well with the prices, is this sooner or later that we're going to have a fundamental shift away from fossil fuels?
I think it's an evolution that's going on. I think you mentioned electric power, and I was recently with a bunch of the leaders of the electric power industry. They do look to be net zero carbon by 2035 or 2040. Many of them are moving that direction. Other parts of it, I think it evolves over time. There are 280 million cars in the United States, and about 279 million of them run on gasoline, and I don't think people are going to throw away their cars. So I think this is a longer evolution. And I think there's what happens in the U.S., but the U.S., remember, is only 15% of CO2 emissions. China's twice that. India, other emerging markets are looking towards commercial energy to get away from burning wood and waste in people's houses with the health consequences. So I think this is something that unfolds time. Directionally where it's going, that's clear.
Directionally, the timing really matters, and the bets can be rather substantial. In your book, you point out how many jobs in the United States, I think there's 10 million, are tied to the energy industry. We also have trillions of dollars globally. Who's putting bets on which side of this? And we saw a report today that Exxon, basically internal documents leaked, suggest that Exxon is not moving as quickly as maybe some others away from fossil fuel emissions. China certainly might benefit. You point out in your book, Russia maybe not. Who's betting on which side of this?
Well, let me say, I think the Exxon thing, of course, that's a still unfolding story. But I think what's happening is all major companies now are looking at their emissions and saying, what are they going to be? And then the question becomes, how do you mitigate them? And in the new map, there's this whole chapter called Breakthrough Technologies, based upon the work that Ernie Moniz, the former energy secretary, and I led for Bill Gates Foundation and Breakthrough Energy Coalition, about the technologies we need. And one of them that's really very major is what's called carbon capture, carbon mitigation, simply when you look at the numbers. And I think that's where we're going to see increased investment going in terms of research on that to meet it. In terms of countries, China's a significant winner here because unlike the U.S., it imports 75% of its oil, and it regards that as a major strategic problem, particularly in the geopolitical issues that are now developing. And it has a dominant position in many of what they call the new energies. For instance, about 70% of the solar panels in the world are made in China, another 10% by Chinese companies. And it's Chinese manufacturing that's partly responsible for this revolution in solar costs, which have come way down. So, they would be a big beneficiary of this.
One of the things that I was surprised and I learned from your book is the Department of Energy under President Trump is investing an awful lot of money in research, science and research, some of which actually has to go to renewables.
Right. $6.5 billion in basic science research, and that's the foundation, really the true foundation of an energy transition. And that's been pretty consistent. That has been one area of bipartisan cooperation in seeing the importance of maintaining that commitment. And this is where the U.S. strength really comes from, which is we have this incredible ecosystem that goes from 17 national labs, that kind of expenditure, universities, companies, startups. No other country has that advantage in new technologies. Take wind and solar. Those are 50-year-old industries, but it's only in the last 10 years that they've really become so competitive. So it takes time. And so the investment you make now really pays off, but it can take 10 or 20 years from now.
Dan, draw one other contrast that, again, I got from your book, The New Map, and that is between Russia, which is very dependent on fossil fuels, goodness knows, and Saudi Arabia, which is also very dependent, but they have that Vision 2030 campaign going on. Does Russia have anything similar to that about what comes after fossil fuels?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the other day, Vladimir Putin said it's great. Our budget is only now 30% oil instead of being 40% oil, the money coming from it. But I think Russia's been talking about diversification for 20 years since Putin came to power, and it's really not happening. In fact, I was at a conference where I asked Putin that question. He and Chancellor Merkel were on the platform about diversification, but we got sidetracked because I mentioned shale, and he really doesn't like U.S. shale. So he gave me his opinions on that, which were pretty strong. So I think Saudi Arabia is trying to do it, but it's hard to shift an economy that is so dependent upon oil. It was hard before COVID. It's more difficult right now. And I think one of the things the Saudis, it's clear to them, in order to diversify away from oil, you actually need some oil revenues.
So, Dan, finally, unfair question, but I think it's on a lot of people's minds, is you compare President Trump with former Vice President Biden's energy policy. Let's take a counterfactual, go down both paths for a moment. If President Trump's elected versus President Biden, if he's elected, what difference will it make in the time it takes to get to really sustainable energy?
Well, I don't think there's any analysis to actually say that, but you certainly know $2 trillion going into that is going to try and speed adaptation of electric cars and so forth. But, David, what's actually interesting to me, and it goes back to your earlier question about the R&D spending, you have these what seem very diametrically opposed plans, but then you look what's actually happening in the economy, you look what the electric power industry is doing, and that's going to happen under Democrats or Republicans. But certainly there would be a lot going into it. However, listening to that interview with the mayor of San Francisco reminds one that we're also going to have to spend a lot of money repairing our economy and particularly bringing back small business, which has been so devastated by the COVID crisis.
Okay, Dan, it's always a pleasure to spend time with you. Thank you so much. That's Dan Yergin. He's IHS Market Vice Chairman and the author of the new book, The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. And now there's breaking news, actually. Governor Andrew Cuomo has been speaking. He says that New York City schools in viral hotspots will close tomorrow. This is backing off Mayor de Blasio's position that all schools would stay open or shut. Now they're going to pick certain ones that are in certain hotspots. In the meantime, White House aide Caroline Leavitt tests positive for COVID. Coming up, our swing state series leading to the election moves on to Michigan this week, and we start with an overview from Oakland University professor David Dulio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We continue our swing state series leading up to the election, looking this week at the state of Michigan, a critical state on the road to the White House. And here to help set the stage, we welcome now David Dulio. He is professor of political science at Oakland University. Professor, thank you so much for being here. So treat us like your students. Tell us what we need to know about Michigan this year, right now, politically.
Well, thanks for having me, David. It's a state that is, as you note, really central to both candidates' electoral strategy to reach the magic number of 270 electoral votes. And as expected, this has been a pretty heated campaign here in the Wolverine State for the last several months.
So the Wolverine State went very narrowly for President Trump last time. What tipped it over the edge? I mean, for example, we hear about Macomb County a fair amount there on the northern border of Detroit.
Sure. I would say that a number of things tipped the scale in Trump's direction. Or maybe I should say, when you win a state by less than 11,000 votes, you could point to any number of things that would deliver that margin of victory. I would say that a couple of things are important to that result. One is that the Clinton campaign basically ignored Michigan until the very end, and that was part of their assumption that Michigan was going to be part of that solid blue wall that, of course, crumbled on Election Day 2016. And part of that was the fact that folks in Michigan, as well as in places across the country, weren't terribly enthused about Hillary Clinton's candidacy. Whether that changes with Joe Biden, it remains to be seen. You mentioned Macomb County. Very important part of our state. It's been a bellwether of sorts over the last 10 or 20 years. And I would point you to one stat that is really important for me when I look back at 2016 and that result. Donald Trump got 35,000 more votes in Macomb County alone than Mitt Romney did 4 years prior. And conversely, Hillary Clinton got 35,000 fewer votes than Barack Obama did. Now, does that mean that there are 35,000 people in Macomb County who switched? Of course not. But is it 6, 7, or 8,000? Absolutely. And the rest is driven by turnout. Trump drove some voters to the polls who hadn't voted 4 years before, and many who showed up for Obama simply didn't for Clinton.
So Professor Giulio, give us a sense about issues. If this were a week ago, I think I'm going to ask you how Michiganders will respond to the nomination of Judge Barrett to the Supreme Court, replacing Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now I think I have to ask you about COVID-19, the president being stricken by COVID-19, now in the hospital as we speak. What is going to be driving voters to the polls and causing them to vote one way or the other?
Well, here, the economy is always front and central. It is an issue that's dominated discussions here in Michigan, dominated politics here in Michigan. It was central in 2016. Then candidate Trump came here with a message that was very populist in nature, talking about bad trade deals, whether it was NAFTA or TPP. Interestingly, in the 2016 Democratic primary, Bernie Sanders campaigned here with much the same message. Trump has continued that messaging here in 2020, talking about the USMCA as a replacement for NAFTA, and he's certainly taking credit for that, trying to message to voters in places like Macomb County, auto workers, folks tied to the auto industry, that it's going to be a much better deal for them than NAFTA was. And I also think, interestingly, Joe Biden has come and also talked directly to the manufacturing folks, talking about his policies would be make it in America, buy American, and really sort of honing in on that, again, what I would say is a populist message in some way.
Okay. Let me ask one last question. I actually was in high school when George Wallace won the primary in Michigan. Why is Michigan so unpredictable when it comes to elections?
Because it's a competitive state. I think that's a great question. And as you know, before Trump won in 2016, Democratic candidates at the presidential level had carried the state for several election cycles back to the 80s. But that Democratic dominance at the presidential level really masks some underlying competitiveness here in Michigan between the two major parties. Republicans have had success in statewide elections for governor, for Secretary of State, Attorney General, and the like. So it's a competitive state through and through, and it's going to be competitive here again in 2020.
And what about your governor? Your governor's been pretty tough on the question of COVID-19. She's run into trouble with your state Supreme Court now. At the same time, as I understand it, her approval rating's pretty high. What's going on with that tussle with the Supreme Court?
Sure. The Michigan Supreme Court just on Friday handed down a verdict that one of the state laws that the governor was using to unilaterally impose orders through executive order, which is her power to do, but they said that one of those laws from 1945 was unconstitutional, and therefore the orders that she had been giving were now null and void. The Attorney General just recently announced that her office would no longer enforce those orders. So we're in a bit of a state of flux here to sort of see where it goes from here, how the governor works with the state legislature, which is controlled by Republicans.
Okay, many thanks to David Giulio. He's Oakland University professor of political science, getting us set up on our Swing States series, starting with the state of Michigan. We'll cover that all this week. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For more on our Swing State series, now we welcome Democrat Sheldon Neely. He is mayor of my hometown, Flint, Michigan. Great to have you back with us, Mayor. Always good to talk to you. Give us a sense of how Flint is reacting to this election right now.
Well, everybody's still in a state of flux right now, trying to make sure that we make the best choices for our families and our way of life and our particular agendas. And so we're promoting just to engage in the greatest American right that we have as American citizens, and that's the right to choose, and that's the right to vote. And so we're doing well here in the city of Flint. You know, we're at the intersection of crisis as it relates to all the things that's going on with the pandemic, also with the civil unrest, and then we still are ongoing water issues that we have here in the Flint. But we're prayerful and optimistic that we're going to be on the other side of this very soon.
President Trump clearly is trying to reach out to the African-American voter. Flint has a substantial African-American population. Is his word resonating right now with your fellow citizens of Flint?
Well, yeah. I'm not for sure if it's resonating, but we definitely know that we're pushing back against the dominant tendencies of American society that always didn't like black or brown individuals. And we're working our way through it, and that's why it's so important for especially black and brown individuals to get out and participate in this vote. And so we're working our way through it, and we have a lot of civil unrest as it relates to all the trauma that our American society is facing with the element of race in our communities. But we're working our way through it, and I'm just very happy that we're a resilient community, and we're taking the mindset from victims to victors here in your hometown.
Yeah, well, so Mayor, it does strike me that there's been some demonstrations clearly in Flint. At the same time, I remember we interviewed your sheriff of Genesee County at one point, who actually marched with a lot of the marchers. You seem to have been able to avoid a lot of the violence. Is that impression correct? And if so, how'd you manage that?
Well, yeah, it is correct. And what we're doing here in the city of Flint, we're not just talking about the things that can be done. We are making the necessary changes to level the field of equality here. You know, we've taken the oldest American holiday, African American holiday, and made it a real holiday here in the city of Flint. The Juneteenth holiday is actually an observed holiday, a paid day off for workers. We've done that. We've outlawed chokeholds and different things of that nature. And also right now we're considering the no-knock search warrants to ban those as well inside the city of Flint. So we're actually making the changes as necessary for the protesters that's engaging. You know, we're elevated the level of protest to actually change and making the level of equality rise up, especially inside the city of Flint. So I think that's why we've seen a level of peaceful demonstration here in the city of Flint, because we're actually listening and making sure that those voices are heard. And
finally, Mr. Mayor, do you have a sense of the extent to which people will go actually out physically to the polls as opposed to vote by absentee ballot?
Well, people are actually voting early. Early voting has started here in the city of Flint. We have 6 remote locations where people can take their absentee ballots and drop them off. I've made every fire station inside the city of Flint. We've put a drop box there so people can get their absentee ballots. If they want to drop them off early, they can drop them off at a fire station, the police department, and also in front of City Hall. Right. So we're making it very accessible and very easy. And if people need to mail theirs back, as long as they mail them back by October 19th, our local clerk's office will get them, and that vote will be counted.
Mayor, thank you so very much for being with us. Mayor Sheldon Neely, Democrat of my hometown, and that is Flint, Michigan. Coming up, Balance of Power continues, and we're going to talk about that Supreme Court nomination and whether it goes forward, given what's going on with COVID-19. This is Bloomberg.